Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capellos in Ottawa on this Thursday. Tonight, interprovincial pipeline battle lines.
The world is going to need more oil in particular. We need to be a growing share of that growing market especially.
The insistence is on a northern proposal that doesn't make economic sense and involves the lifting of the oil tanker ban. Well, we're against that.
BC hits back as Alberta and Ottawa approach a pipeline deal. Premier David Eby says it's a no-go on a new bitumen pipeline to his provincial coastline. The Premier will be here live coming up to talk about that. And our front bench with Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Peter Julian will join us in moments on the political consequences of the energy exporting divide. Plus, expanding trade in the Middle East. The Prime Minister signs an investment agreement with the United Arab Emirates. What potential is there for more trade with the Middle East? Our Rachel Aiello is in Abu Dhabi, and she'll bring us the answer a little bit later on in the show. First, though,
one way to increase trade with other countries would be with a pipeline to British Columbia's west coast. But the Liberals killed Northern Gateway in 2016, resulting in billions in lost opportunities for Canadian workers and businesses.
This government was elected to deliver nation-building projects. The federal government has been engaged in constructive talks with the government of Alberta, and we will have more to say in a few weeks.
While the Liberals have made it illegal for Canadian companies to load Canadian ships with Canadian oil, U.S. tankers can continue to travel off BC's coast and take their oil to countries around the world.
The Premier of Alberta has said she's quite supportive of what we're doing and is looking forward to finishing the conversations with the Prime Minister.
debate in the House of Commons on a possible deal between Alberta and Ottawa to get a pipeline to BC Tidewater. The feds and province are negotiating a so-called memorandum of understanding on energy policy that could make the project viable. Sources in both governments say the MOU could be announced any day and would include a deal on the industrial price on carbon that could make the Pathways carbon capture project more economical and pave the way for that pipeline, along with a carve-out to the tanker ban potentially along BC's coast. Here's Alberta Premier Danielle Smith first on the state of negotiations.
We're working on it. Still very hopeful. I was hopeful before the Grey Cup, which was one of the deadlines he had set for new major projects. We know that we've got a little bit more work to do on the technical side to be able to submit our pipeline proposal for consideration to the major projects office. We've targeted the spring on that. And if we do get to an agreement with the federal government, we'll certainly let you know. And but I remain very hopeful as our negotiations continue.
This afternoon, BC's Premier David Eby released a statement that reads in part, "These talks about eliminating the ban on oil tankers off our coast have taken place without anyone from British Columbia at the table. Like many British Columbians," the statement goes on to say, "I learned of these talks through a news article. Real jobs and prosperity are put at risk from this extremely early stage and unfunded proposal of a heavy oil pipeline. That's something that BC and Canada cannot afford at this time." Now, we're going to be speaking with the Premier Eby, I should say, in just about 10 minutes. First, though, let's set the stage with our front bench. Marco Mendicino is here. He's former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Mark Carney and a former Liberal cabinet minister. He's now a senior counsel and strategic advisor for Castles. CTV political analyst and former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is with us. He's now a policy advisor at Edelman. And Peter Julian is a former longtime NDP MP and House Leader. Hello to all three of you. Thanks so much for making the time for the conversation. Marco, I'll start with you. BC's statement, the Premier's statement, certainly adds another layer of complexity to all this. What do you think is really going on?
Well, I think Premier Eby is expressing some anxiety around the potential for a memorandum of understanding, which has been reported in the press as being imminent between Canada and Alberta. I think it's important that we listen to him and to all premiers. And I think on the other side of the ledger, it is remarkable that Premier Danielle Smith has changed both the tone and the substance of her dialogue. And it seems that we are on the cusp of seeing a new level, perhaps an unprecedented level, of collaboration between Ottawa and Alberta when it comes to energy. So I would just conclude by saying, I don't think that it is a necessary precondition that BC and Alberta, or any province for that matter, agree on every mile of how we develop energy projects. But I do think that there is broad alignment when it comes to creating jobs. I do believe that there is broad alignment when it comes to addressing climate. I do believe that there's broad alignment when it comes to working closely with First Nations. And that is has to be the bedrock on which we drive forward, because we need to get our energy to market, and everything the government has done, whether it's major projects or some of these bilateral relationships and agreements that we're negotiating, has to be geared towards that.
The idea, though, of some sort of bilateral agreement between the federal government and Alberta, James, substantively, we don't know for sure what's in it, but all of what's being reported is not being denied at this point by either side. Symbolically, what do you think it says?
Well, the package of clips that you played in the introduction to this conversation, I think, was interesting because everybody had a point. Danielle Smith says we have a valuable commodity that the rest of the world wants, and she's right, and it's extraordinarily valuable to all Canadians to get it to those markets. Andrew Scheer said we need to diversify our trade away from the United States, and he's right. This is a commodity that we should get to other markets, so we're not have 97% of our oil exports just going to the United States. Minister Hodgson said, have some patience. We're working with the province of Alberta, and we'll have something to announce in a little while, and be patient. He's right. We should be. If they have some rapprochement and some engagement, we should have open minds about a good faith agreement that seems to be about to be mentioned. Then finally, Premier Eby said, where's the British Columbia voice at this? And he's right. Premier Eby makes a very important point. That picture of Danielle Smith from Alberta and the Prime Minister of Canada, who's from Alberta, who represents an Ottawa riding, Minister Hodgson, who's from Toronto, and Andrew Scheer, who's from Saskatchewan, all having these robust debates about a very important piece of infrastructure that's going to go through British Columbia and cut right through Indigenous territory. British Columbia has a voice. And by the way, Premier Eby is an important voice in this, but he doesn't speak for all British Columbians. And British Columbia does not seem to be at the table in all of this. And this is going to be a massive project, conceivably, of enormous environmental, economic, and political consequence for British Columbia. And our voice hasn't been heard as British Columbians.
At this point, Peter, we don't have any of the, we have, like I said, substantively, a lot is out there in reporting that isn't being denied, but we don't actually have the document in front of us. Why do you think even at this stage, or even when it was being speculated a number of weeks ago by the Premier in Alberta, why do you think it's led to the reaction it has with Premier Eby?
Well, I think it's very concerning that these discussions have been basically taking place behind BC's back. I was at the BC NDP convention last weekend. There's a broad consensus around the North Coast tanker ban for very obvious reasons. So it's not just environmental. It's also the economic impacts. We're talking about thousands of jobs in the fisheries, tens of thousands of jobs in tourism that could be at risk if we reopen the North Coast to tanker traffic. And so the fact that this is happening, that the Carney government is negotiating with the Alberta Conservative government is very concerning. British Columbia hasn't been at the table, and BC has very, very legitimate reasons for saying no. There's a broad consensus around this issue. As I say, both environmental and economic impacts. It's surprising to me that the Carney government would disregard what is a very, very strong public opinion in British Columbia around this issue.
I should point out, we did ask for the federal government to come and respond. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say, as a fellow British Columbian, Peter makes some important points there, right? And I agree with him about the British Columbia voice not being heard. But if you look at public opinion polls, Peter, as you know, British Columbians are divided on this. There's not an absolute public opinion majority against all this. And tanker traffic does exist along that corridor. It just happens to be Americans who are going along that corridor. And, the idea that, there's a tanker ban or there's no tanker ban, there is such thing as a middle ground. There's such thing as having tankers go in and out of those waters in a way that is judicious and responsible, that has world-class technology, that it keeps our waters and our environment safe, it is done in a responsible way. We know that can happen because it's already happening with American tankers going right across our shoreline. So it can be done. The question is, I think to your point, Peter, is that there is a political price to pay and there is a conversation that needs to be had. And the question is Mark Carney prepared to spend some of his political capital in order to do a nation-building project that would be good for all Canadians? That's up to him to show that leadership. And, we're in a wait-and-see moment.
Well, the Trans Mountain Pipeline
ascertain. One moment. I'll get to you both in one second. I just want to be clear. From what I can ascertain, other tankers can go through it, but you cannot dock somewhere and basically load up or unload oil, which is effectively what renders a new pipeline impossible at this point. So there is like a salient difference about what exists right now, and if it were to be a carve-out, I guess, per se. Peter, I'll get to you, and then I'll go to you first, and then Marco, like what change that would entail. Peter, you were just about to say something.
Well, but just the other point, of course, is that Trans Mountain Pipeline is under capacity. This was paid for tens of billions of dollars in public funds, a huge public subsidy. And so it's a bit disingenuous for folks in Alberta to say, well, let's have another pipeline. Let's throw away the North Coast tanker ban. Let's run roughshod over Indigenous rights. And Indigenous peoples have been very clear about maintaining the North Coast tanker ban. And so to do all that when you have a hugely publicly subsidized pipeline that is running under capacity, that makes no sense at all. And this is why the Carney government negotiating behind BC's back, it's very concerning to me that these kinds of actions are taking place.
Two quick things out of that, Marco, for you. The first is on TMX. It's a lot closer to capacity than it used to be. I actually went out to the terminal to see like the process of loading them up and all that stuff. The big picture from TMX right now, which BC has officially actually endorsed, is increasing its capacity, because if you optimize that pipeline, they think you can add something like 350,000 barrels. The argument for from BC right now is, let's do that. And basically not do the other thing. On the point that Peter makes around like BC not essentially being at the table, that is to me the biggest head scratcher at this point, because it doesn't seem to align with the kind of rhetoric that we've heard from the Prime Minister and the federal government in the previous months. Do you think that there's been no outreach to BC? Like, does that seem feasible to you? And if it is, do you think that's a mistake?
Well, I think it is very likely, and in fact on the record, that the Prime Minister has had wide-ranging discussions with all premiers about energy, both bilaterally and multilaterally at First Ministers' meetings, and I'm quite confident that he will continue that conversation with Premier Eby in the context of many of these initiatives that we're discussing, including a potential MOU with Alberta, given that it straddles those provincial boundaries. But I want to say a couple of things in response to the points that my friend Peter has made. One is, having just spent time in both Vancouver and Calgary earlier this week, I think we should begin with the prima facie assumption that premiers who are speaking on behalf of their people are doing so in good faith, and that Premier Eby is quite proud to champion LNG projects that have been supported by the federal government. And I think at the same time, Premier Smith is putting forward what she believes in her best assessment and opinion are projects that will allow us to become an energy superpower, and that is the objective here. Let's be clear about that we want to get more of our energy to market, and that we have been historically held back by duplicative regulation and too much red tape, and the Major Projects Office is all about cutting through that so that we can achieve that goal. And the second thing is that, look, I'll come back to what I said at the outset. There's not always going to be 100% agreement on every single mile of how we get the energy to market. But what is important is that we work together collaboratively. And there may very well be lessons that could be learned from the way in which Premier Eby has worked with First Nations to get their energy to market through LNG that can be championed elsewhere, including in Alberta. And I just think that we need to go from gridlock to green light when it comes to these energy projects. The one thing I hear right across industry leadership is we're being held back, and we need to really unshackle ourselves and do it in a way that is consistent with all of the objectives and the criteria that are in the major projects legislation.
And I do understand the sentiment, James. And I think, look, for months, premiers were talking in the same way, being very collaborative. But this proposition and the way it's unfolded, for whatever reason, has generated a very different type of response, in particular from Premier Eby. And you're right that, public opinion polls does show a majority of support for a pipeline, but he's in a pretty strong position after last week's convention, and he is the premier of the province. And if you look at that number based on party, it isn't the case for NDP supporters.
Yeah, and look, there's politics being played in this in British Columbia as well. Look, I don't think David Eby is insincere in his position. I'm not suggesting that, but the official opposition Conservatives in the province of British Columbia are in rough, bad, not good shape. And the political polls in British Columbia suggest that David Eby could probably win a majority if he went into an election campaign. And the right in British Columbia on the ground politically are divided, and there's this political party, One BC, that is extraordinarily toxic when it comes to Aboriginal and Indigenous issues. And I think there's an opportunity here for David Eby to be, frankly, to come in and say that this nonsense has to stop and Indigenous voices need to be heard. And I actually think that would be a very interesting and tough political environment for anybody to say that what's happened has not been really toxic. So I think there's politics on this in that regard. And yeah, he comes out of his party convention in a good position, also because he wants to appeal to Green Party voters, because the Green Party has also collapsed in British Columbia. That being said, though, that's the politics of it. It's a political show. That's the politics of it. But in terms of statecraft and the importance of a prime minister, British Columbia is the third largest and fastest growing province in Canada. And northern British Columbia, I can tell you as somebody who lived in the north, northern British Columbia feels completely cut out of this, and Indigenous voices in the north feel completely left out of this. It's true that Justin Trudeau canceled the Northern Gateway pipeline, but it collapsed in its public support because the way in which Enbridge, the company, did not engage as a company, and frankly, our government didn't do everything that we could to bring in Indigenous voices to make them feel part of the process. Northern British Columbians and Indigenous coastal First Nations, they're not just another stakeholder to deal with. They're people who feel that they own this land and they have an obligation to this land from over 10,000 years of hereditary history in that part of the country, and they can't just be bought off, and their voices need to be heard, and so far they've been completely shut out.
Last word to you, Peter. I feel like there's something in there that you probably agree with.
I sometimes agree with my colleague James. I think the reality is the Harper government tried to ram things through. It failed. The Carney government undertaking the same kind of lack of consultation and having a negotiation behind the back of the BC NDP government, I find that very disconcerting. And it's certainly not what Mr. Carney promised when he ran in the federal election in the spring. He talked about consultation. He talked about a different approach in government. We're not seeing that. We're seeing an approach that is very similar to the Stephen Harper government in terms of the things that take place behind closed doors.
Okay, I will just really quickly say before I take a break that we did reach out to Minister LeBlanc's office to see if they had a comment on Premier Eby's statement about being sort of left out of the meetings. His office have told us that they will not be providing a comment. So instead, I'll take a quick commercial break. On the other end of that break, Premier Eby will join me live in our generous front bench. We'll be back after that interview to talk about some other stories on our watch, including a push from the U.S. ambassador to stick with F-35. So we're back in a moment, though, with BC's Premier David Eby.
The province of British Columbia has signaled that it will support increasing capacity for the Trans Mountain pipeline. So if that happens and there's not a new pipeline, is that enough for your government to sign on and commit to an MOU and satisfy your energy needs?
No. I think that what we're seeing is that there's a change in the public dialogue about the need for oil and natural gas. Premier Eby and I agree on a lot of things. And one of them is that we agreed on dredging the Second Narrows to increase capacity, and we agree on expanding Trans Mountain Pipeline as well. But as you can see, I would like to see expansions in all directions.
Welcome back to Power Play, and our top story today, a potential pipeline that could go from Alberta to BC's north coast. Alberta and the feds are working on a memorandum of understanding that we have been told by multiple sources could be imminent, and sources also tell us it could include support for a new pipeline that will require an exemption under the tanker ban that applies to that north coast. BC's Premier David Eby is with us live right now to talk about that. Hi, Premier. Pleasure to see you as always. Thank you very much for making the time.
Hey, Vashti, thanks for having me.
So I read your statement this afternoon that said that you were caught off guard by the fact this was happening. And I'm just wondering how that's the case, given the possibility of a memorandum of understanding. The existence of these negotiations has been out in the public sphere now for the better part of a month. Have you not asked anyone in the federal government where things are at?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly aware that Premier Smith has been pushing hard for her project to be listed, as she described it, on the major project list by Grey Cup weekend. It obviously was not. There certainly was not discussion about a meeting between Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the federal government negotiating the terms by which a project will be delivered in British Columbia without British Columbia at the table. So that was the certainly surprising news that came to me and headlined the Globe and Mail. I think it was surprising to many people in Canada. It was certainly an unpleasant surprise for the coastal First Nations, who the foundation of their support for about 10,000 jobs, the largest private sector investment in Canadian history, LNG Canada, is premised on the existence of the tanker ban. And so all of us were thoroughly both disappointed and, yes, caught off guard.
Have you had any communication or conversation with the Prime Minister about the tanker ban?
Yes, I've outlined for the Prime Minister, senior ministers, backbenchers, the Canadian public, the British Columbia public, anyone who will listen, that the oil tanker ban in British Columbia off the Canadian North Coast is the condition precedent, it is the requirement, it is the foundational building block for coastal First Nations support for projects that are worth in the neighborhood of $100 billion. Solism's LNG, LNG Canada Phase 2, massive expansions to the Port of Prince Rupert, projects that are the reason why British Columbia has 4 times more major projects on Canada's list than any other province in the country. And I have explained again and again that for these projects to be successful, for them to be able to go ahead, we need the support of coastal First Nations. It is fragile. They are not enthusiastic about these projects, but they are willing to tolerate them in exchange for protecting the coast from a heavy oil spill. And that coast for them represents a $1.7 billion economy, including fishing and tourism opportunities, all of which are gone in an instant with the heavy oil spill. And right now, as we speak, a barge with freight on it is sinking off the coast of Bella Bella and is being towed away. These accidents are not a figment of coastal First Nations imagination. There was a huge diesel spill there. One heavy oil spill, it can't be cleaned up. It is existential for them.
And I certainly do understand that. But I have never heard the Prime Minister or anyone in the federal government say that they are going to get rid of that tanker ban writ large. At this point, what is being reported is the potential for a carve-out should a pipeline that we don't even know the details of at some point go ahead. And when it comes to the LNG projects that you mentioned, the first 2 that you said, if I recall, are the first 2, it was the first project on the first major projects list and the first project on the second major projects list that just came out last week. So there's a ton of buy-in and support from the federal government for those resource projects in your province. Why are you, I guess, staking out the position you have right now when they have never said that they're going to do things to put those projects in jeopardy? In fact, they've put their support behind them.
Okay, well, first of all, you and I are speculating about the contents of the MOU. And I understand why you might be speculating. You're a member of the media. They haven't announced it yet. But I don't understand why I'm speculating about an MOU negotiated with Saskatchewan and Alberta about British Columbia and what the content of it might be. But the idea that the Hecate Strait, which is one of the most dangerous and most treacherous areas for ships to pass through, that somehow Danielle Smith and Scott Moe know better than literally generations of politicians from all parties that have observed through practice and then recently through legislation a ban on oil tankers off this coast simply because it is so dangerous and so precarious, that Danielle Smith and Scott Moe know better. They feel to me like 2 tourists wearing sandals wandering off into the woods in the North Shore of Vancouver saying, "Don't worry about us, we'll be fine." They don't know what they're talking about. And not only that, there's not a real project here. And the threat to the projects that I told you about, those 10,000 plus jobs, the largest private sector investment in Canadian history that is reaching final investment decision, the threat to those projects is the coastal First Nations saying, if you lift the tanker ban, we will no longer support these projects. We don't even like them in the first place, and the only reason we're tolerating them is because of the tanker ban. And I don't know that anyone appears to get this from Alberta or Saskatchewan, or disappointingly, the PMO, if in fact these conversations are happening in the total absence of the coastal First Nations. They haven't been included either.
I totally take the point that you're making around not being at the table. And I can see how the way in which this is reported and the involvement of British Columbia without you not being there would be egregious to you. If I put that, and I get it, I'm not trying to counter that in any way. But if I put that aside for a second and I listen very closely to what Alberta's premier has said about this, she isn't saying, who cares about those First Nations? She isn't saying, who cares about BC's LNG projects? What I have mostly heard her say is, we hope that BC can exploit those natural resources to the benefit of British Columbians and Canadians. We just want the potential ability to do the same thing should the opportunity be viable. And we have not had, in her view, as I hear it, a federal government that even in principle was supportive of that. That isn't exactly the way that you're characterizing it. And I wonder why the two of you, for example, cannot engage in a conversation at such a critical time for this country to find some kind of middle ground.
Yeah, I guess, you would do a great job writing speeches for Danielle Smith if she put it that way, but that's not what she's saying. She is saying that there are 9 bad laws or something like that in Canada, and that if they continue to exist, that they mean that Canada is broken and it is not functioning. And one of those bad laws is the oil tanker ban off of the coast of British Columbia. And she wants that ban removed. She wants that law rescinded without a single company, not even one. She hasn't even got one company that's willing to come forward and say, hey, Alberta is willing to underwrite this thing. The federal government's here. They got a bunch of money for us. They're gonna help us. If they're able to do these things, we would love to build that pipeline. And the reason there is no pipeline company willing to come forward and say this is because they don't want to build it. It's going to cost $50 billion plus. We already have a publicly owned pipeline that costs $30 billion to taxpayers. It's not even fully being used, and we're not being obstructionist about this. In fact, we are spending some political capital here in British Columbia to say, look, we get it, Alberta. You want more access to Tidewater. Let's figure out how we expand the capacity at the TMX pipeline, a pipeline that we fought tooth and nail and was imposed on us by Ottawa. But let's sit down at the table and figure out a path forward. But instead of that, all we get is a $20 million PR exercise from a premier who's in political trouble, trying to remove an oil tanker ban off the coast of our province that is the foundation for more than 10,000 jobs and billions of dollars in economic activity for our province and for the entire country. And so that's the frustration that I have, and it will continue to be, and I'll continue to advocate on this because real project should always trump made-up project.
But when she talks about the tanker ban, with due respect, Premier, she is reflecting what those potential pipeline proponents have said, which is that if there is to be a pipeline, an additional pipeline beyond TMX, that tanker ban, in the case of that pipeline, essentially renders it null and void. I understand your point that it puts your projects in jeopardy, but so far those projects are going ahead. They are on the major projects list. Why is it okay for your province to profit from its natural resources and not for Alberta?
I think, Vashi, with respect to the question, the idea that Alberta has been frustrated in realizing access to market is bizarre. $30 billion in taxpayer dollars went to building the first pipeline that is now publicly owned, that's not even at full capacity and could be significantly expanded. And that's not enough for Alberta. Alberta also wants billions of dollars for the Pathways plan project that's going to reduce carbon emissions. And why not $50 billion more for a second taxpayer-owned pipeline, because there is no private company that is willing to do that. And the entitlement, the belief that only Alberta should have access to that kind of money from the federal government and that kind of support and that kind of hand-holding, it is an entitlement that cannot continue. Alberta, just like every other province and territory in this country, we all have to work together. For our part in BC, that includes sucking it up and having a hard conversation about the TMX pipeline that's already publicly owned, that we fought tooth and nail, but we're willing to sit at the table with Alberta about. But the idea that BC has to take our private sector projects and put them at risk for nothing from Alberta, They have no project, no proponent, no route, no permits, no nothing. And we have to put all of our hard work that has been done over years with coastal First Nations and communities along the line, bringing people together to deliver this thing. And Danielle Smith can have a $20 million communications project in her province, and that somehow is more important than the actual projects that we worked years to deliver. Like, there just comes a time when we have to say enough is enough. Like, we don't ask for Danielle's support or her assistance in these projects, or her province's support or assistance in these all we ask is that they stay out of the way. Let us deliver these projects for the country. There's a reason why we have 4 times more projects than other provinces on the board, because we have been pushing hard and working hard with communities to deliver these projects. And there is already a fully taxpayer-funded and owned pipeline that Alberta is not using to capacity. Why don't you give us a call once that pipeline's being used?
But the difference is geography, right? Like, your province is the coast. And that necessitates, if you are trying to export resources, involvement of British Columbia. And when you say, why is, you're intimating that essentially Alberta wants too much, that they are entitled by asking for additional pipeline export capacity. Would you be okay with just one LNG project, Premier? If someone said, no, you should just stop at LNG 1?
I'm trying to imagine a scenario where British Columbia and the federal government are having private meetings about Alberta and Saskatchewan in the absence of those provinces. I'm trying to imagine what the reaction would be. I understand the need to have conversations. I understand the need for Premier Smith to advocate for her province, and that's fine. But what I am saying, and I'm not sure I can be any clearer about it, is her advocacy around the oil tanker ban puts at risk real projects with private sector proponents that have all their approvals in place, that are approaching but have not yet reached final investment decision, because it jeopardizes the coalition of support and tolerance that we built for these projects in British Columbia. Now, I am not doing, I'm not having secret meetings with Ottawa about Alberta and Saskatchewan. I want to work with Alberta on electrical intertie, on the TMX pipeline. I want to work with Scott Moe on nutrient and potash and keeping that product in Canada so it doesn't get tariffed by Donald Trump on the way out of Washington State. But man, it makes it hard to do that when I'm subject to a PR exercise out of Alberta for a project that doesn't exist.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. I've taken a lot of your time. I appreciate it as always, Premier. Thank you.
Thanks, Vashti. Appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, as always. David Eby is BC's Premier. We'll take another quick break. On the other end of that break, our front bench will be back to talk about a fighter jet fight of sorts. The feds continue to debate whether or not to purchase U.S.-made F-35s while Sweden was in town to pitch the Gripens. We'll talk about the politics of that next.
Interoperability, interchangeability, and joint. Those words are all there in describing exactly how the F-35, an international plane that Canada bought in from the beginning, that it characterized a hallmark of how defense cooperation between the U.S., Canada, and other countries really, really works well.
There needs to be more jobs created out of the F-35 contract. That's clear to me and clear to this government. And at the same time, we think that we can use military procurement to get more. And that is why we're looking indeed at the Gripen.
The Swedish delegation here in Canada this week to in part pitch Saab's Gripen fighter jet is now heading home, with the Fed still weighing whether to pull out of a planned purchase of dozens of American-made F-35s. The U.S. ambassador to Canada has been vocal about his support for the F-35 and hinted repeatedly at what Canada's decision could mean for future trade talks at a conference yesterday. Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Marco Medicino, James Moore, and Peter Julian are back. Thank you all for your patience. I appreciate it. James, I'll start with you. I was at that talk that the ambassador gave yesterday, and every time he could say F-35, he did. He was being interviewed by the head of the Canadian manufacturers and exporters. What signal do you think that sends, or is he attempting to send?
I mean, he needs to be careful that he's going to poison his own argument. I mean, he's not exactly, I think, come onto the national scene in Ottawa and charmed a lot of people with his approach to things. But look, the F-35 program that Canada has bought into is not going to go away. I can understand why. There's some appetite for the Gripen aircraft. It's a very impressive piece of kit. The question is, and you've had people on your show, and I think it'll be a conversation for a while longer yet, is whether or not the $81 billion that was set aside in this federal budget, of which about a quarter is going to go to retention, recruitment, and salary increases, so $60 billion left, whether or not there's margin in there in terms of re-equipping the Canadian forces that might include a second aircraft, a second platform. We are the only country, I believe, in the G7 that doesn't have a secondary platform. So there's an argument for the Gripen. It's said to be cheaper. It's said to be better in the north. It's it diversifies our capacity. But the question is that diversified capacity in our best interest? Does it diminish our ability? Are we still on board for the 88 planes? What does it mean for supply chains? What does it mean for all of the needs that we have for the Canadian forces? The government will make a decision about the F-35 and the supplemental money they put in this budget and whether or not to get a second aircraft. But I think it should be done entirely within the rubric of what is in Canada's best defense interest, number one. Number two, can there be some economic benefits associated with that? And then three, interoperability with the United States should be the third interest in that. Now, those things kind of do combine a bit. But Minister Jolie there saying that her number one concern is jobs. It's not the number one concern. The number one concern is national security and national defense. From that, you hope that jobs flow, but the number one concern should be national defense.
What I garner, Peter, though, from what the ambassador said was that there would be a consequence if the federal government does not proceed with the F-35s. And at the same time, he's saying, oh, you're a sovereign country. I understand the review's going on. But he tied it explicitly to trade talks. What do you make of that?
Well, first off, I mean, we have to recognize that the F-35 program is a troubled program. And the Auditor General flagged the fact that costs have risen over 50%. We're now at $9 billion more for the initial aircraft than we were supposed to pay. It is a very troubled program. And so why would the ambassador flag this in such a public way? And it's because what we've seen from Mr. Carney since he became prime minister is concession after concession on the digital services tax. The Americans pushed back on that, and now these web giants that make tens of billions of dollars of profit in Canada don't pay the digital services tax, which was long overdue. At the end of June, the call from the Donald Trump administration was for Canada to substantially increase its military expenditures, basically said to Canada, jump. And Mr. Carney's reply was, how high? And now we're seeing a budget where many services are being cut for regular families. And at the same time, as James Morris pointed out, $60 billion is going into military procurement. So we have a troubled program on the one hand. On the other hand, we see a government that has conceded time after time after time to the Americans. And that's why you have the U.S. ambassador in an unprecedented way, pushing again to force the government to concede yet again. I hope they do not. And the NDP has been very clear. We think the F-35 purchase should be canceled, that we should not be looking to throw more money into a program that has been experienced so many delays and so many cost overruns. And the reality is we don't have the same presence in the House of Commons, but we will certainly be speaking out to say this doesn't make sense to have more military integration with the American administration at a time when Donald Trump has mused openly about annexing Canada.
And I get all of that, Marco. The fascinating part is like the one and only time I've interviewed the ambassador, he raised the specter of NORAD and the F-35s very quickly, and sort of like, well, there'd have to be a discussion about NORAD. So even though like public sentiment, I think, would back what Peter is saying in a desire to move away from any kind of dependence on the United States, like the fact of the matter is interoperability is key to continental defense at this point, which I imagine is a very challenging thing to balance with the current state of politics.
Yes, and it is fascinating. And I think what you're hearing from the ambassador reflects a degree of frustration from the White House and the Trump administration, perhaps about the lack of pace and progress when it comes to our negotiations. I think on our side of the border, we too are equally frustrated about the lack of progress. And we can talk about the merits of the F-35 versus the Griffin. And I think James, quite accurately laid out some of the criteria, including UVASHI, around interoperability and best bang for buck. And look, the reality is that whichever way this plays out, Canada and the United States will continue to be joined by geography and mutual shared interest when it comes to protecting our skies because of those factors, and also because we are long-standing allies. That does not preclude us from continuing to explore other opportunities when it comes to our relationships in the defense space. One of the things that the Prime Minister did last spring was negotiate a Canada-EU security and defense partnership, and we're now starting to see the practical benefits of that in the form of other agreements, including most recently this week, the visit by the Swedes, where you're going to start to see, I think, some real tangible benefits in that space. But just to bring all of this to full circle, around the frustration and the links between the defense file and the trade file, look, what the Prime Minister has said is true. We're ready to get back to the table. The chairs are there. We're ready to pull in. But, the Americans also have to step up. And I think we want to get back there and find ways in which we can resolve some of the ongoing and lingering issues when it comes to tariffs so that we can both economically prosper going forward.
Okay, I'll leave it there. The ambassador did not sound overly optimistic about those talks restarting, but he seemed to say that there might be a path at some point to it. So I'll leave our conversation there. Thank you, all three of you. Really appreciate you making the time. Marco Medicino, James Moore, and Peter Julian, our front bench on this Thursday. Still ahead tonight on Power Play, Donald Trump signs the Epstein Files bill into law. So when might the big document dump be, and will it actually include everything? We're going to take you live to Washington next.
I expect him to fully comply. I haven't seen her comments, but if she said we'll follow the law, then good. That's what we want. And I'd expect her to. I've known Pam Bondi a long time. I'd expect her to follow the law completely, and they need to do so swiftly. The statute calls for, I think it's 30 days. It's not long that they're supposed to make a report and then make these files available.
I'm sure they are meeting in the White House right now trying to decide how they can get around complying with the law, and it may be that we will ultimately have to take them to court to make sure that they do what the statute says they are required to do, which is tell the American people the truth about what happened, the extent of this child sex ring, and whether the president or other powerful people were involved.
Reaction in Washington the day after President Donald Trump signed a bill to release all government files on sex offender Jeffrey Epstein into law. So what happens now? CTV's Washington Bureau Chief Joy Melvin is with us live to help us unpack what's to come. Hey, Joy, good to see you as always. Does this automatically mean that everything gets made public?
No. That's the short answer. But this is day one and counting 30 days. We have 30 days before the Justice Department has to release these files. And we're talking tens of thousands of documents being stored in a special facility. Things like flight logs, travel records, names, investigations, plea agreements, financial entities that might be tied to Epstein's child sex trafficking ring and involving some rich and powerful people. But already, You played some of those lawmakers. They're very skeptical, and so are some of the survivors about what might actually be shared out there.
And could you expand a little bit on, I guess, the politics of what happens now as well? Because this has been a fascinating, month of ups and downs and positions for the president changing. Do we have any more clarity on why this has been such a vulnerability for him?
Oh, wow. How much time do we have? Okay. Well, Donald Trump has resisted this. His relationship with Epstein. There's been no allegations of wrongdoing, but he had a long-term relationship with him. He's resisted, but there was an about-face, a last-minute, turn from him, allowing this vote to go forward because the pressure from the survivors, the pressure out there from his own MAGA base forced this vote. So now it is law. The Attorney General said she would follow that law, but here's the thing. Last Friday, Donald Trump ordered new investigations into prominent Democrats, just Democrats, people like former President Bill Clinton and Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary. Even though Pam Bondi back in July said there's nothing more to investigate, these new investigations could actually cause a delay, or they could actually withhold some of the material, and because they do not want to jeopardize an active federal investigation. So that is one of the major loopholes, and that's not all that the White House is saying. Anything that jeopardizes national security or defense, we've heard that argument before with Canada, could also delay the release of the files. So certainly a lot of the survivors and many lawmakers today are very skeptical that we're going to find out anything by December 19th.
Okay, appreciate the details. Thanks so much, Joy. Our Washington Bureau Chief, Joy Malbon, live for us in D.C. Let's head very far overseas now to the Prime Minister's trip to the United Arab Emirates. There, Prime Minister Carney is looking to expand trade ties ahead of the G20 in South Africa. Our Rachel Aiello is traveling with the Prime Minister for us in Abu Dhabi, and she has the latest on today's meetings. Rachel.
Hey, Vashi. The Prime Minister spent his day in Abu Dhabi locking in a new investment pact, touring a cultural landmark, and trying to lure capital from big investment funds in one of the world's wealthiest countries. The major tangible outcome of Mark Carney's last 24 hours is the signing of a new Investment Protection Pact, or FIPA, with the UAE, as well as launching new trade talks with the Gulf nation. Those were the outcome of a closed-door meeting that Canadian media was not allowed anywhere near with the president. Now, the PMO readout of the bilat indicated that once that economic agreement, or CEPA as it's known, would expand market access and facilitate billions of dollars in UAE investment into major port, mine, LNG, and critical mineral projects in Canada. But how fast that could happen remains a big question, one I put to Canada UAE Business Council co-chair Jean Charest. So the FIPA agreement took close to 10 years to get done. Are you at all confident that the CEPA could be finished on a faster clip?
Totally. This is, well, one of the reasons these things either get done or not done is leadership. If no one owns it or drives it, it's not going to happen.
Charest went on to say that in his experience, new trade deals don't get done unless the Prime Minister takes the lead. And with Canada-US trade war, diversifying the economy will require some degree of drumming up new business. Charest is in Abu Dhabi for a summit that Carney will be delivering a keynote speech at tomorrow. Tonight, the Prime Minister is dining with the UAE's National Security Advisor. Carney's office is saying there won't be time for the Prime Minister to take reporters' questions in this country before going wheels up to the G20 in South Africa. Vashi?
Rachel, thanks so much. That's Rachel Aiello for us in Abu Dhabi. We're back in a moment right here on Power Play. Welcome back to Power Play. Our top story, of course, what's going on between Alberta, BC, and the federal government. Sources in both the federal government and Alberta saying that they're very close to announcing a memorandum of understanding that could pave the way for a pipeline to BC's west coast. The Premier of BC is not happy about that at all, as you heard earlier on the show from David Eby. He put out a statement saying these talks about eliminating the ban on oil tankers off our coast have taken place without anyone from British Columbia at the table. Like many British Columbians, he said, I learned of these talks through a news article. He goes on to say real jobs and prosperity are put at risk from this extremely early stage and unfunded proposal of a heavy oil pipeline. There'll be lots of reaction throughout the night right here on CTV News Channel. I'm Vashi Capellos. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.